And here we go. So give it just a minute or so as everybody comes in to join us. And I will go ahead and turn off my video and audio and then turn things over to you.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our panel about the power of queer normative world building. I'm really excited to share this panel with some amazing authors today who are going to enlighten us with their views of their characters, their stories, and their experiences. I am Jessica Lucci. I'm best known as a steampunk author and also a poet. You can find me on pretty much any social media, but if you want to find me online so we can communicate with each other, then go to my website. It's www.jessicalucci.org. And so I would like to ask my panelists some questions that will lead us into conversation. My first, let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by queer normative. Queer normative basically means making queerness not different. Among people who are an LGBTQ plus, there's more readership of LGBTQ plus books that have a focus on inclusivity. And I think I can agree, most of you will agree with me that we wish it was more mainstream, that queerness was accepted and more mainstream. Many books and stories in sci-fi and fiction have closeted or newly out of the closet characters. And we have to also be mindful of some characters are written as an LGBTQ plus without any other character definition, sort of a queer Mary Sue. And other stories take place in worlds in which being LGBTQ plus is accepted and normalized. Today, we're going to talk about the power of queer normative world building. So, my first question for whoever wants to take it up first is, what do you look for in LGBTQ plus sci-fi and fantasy?
Okay, well, so hi, I'm E.M. Anderson, and I write contemporary fantasy and cozy fantasy. And to be honest, in queer sci-fi and fantasy, I mean, I'm mostly just looking for queer sci-fi and fantasy still at this point. I think there's more of it now, definitely, than there was when I was younger. But like just in general, I am just looking for it to be queer at all. I will take anything. So that's kind of the stage that I'm at personally.
I totally get that because it's hard to find good queer normative or any queer stories in at all that are entertaining in a alternate universe or science fiction or fantasy worldview. Anybody else want to take up this question?
Well, I'll take the plunge. I'm Thomas Wrightson. I'm currently a writer of science fiction, and what I look for in terms of queer world building stories is the queerness not being shoved in your face, or speculative fiction where sexuality isn't defined. It means, ironically, that you can go back to some older sci-fi like A Fall of Moondust by Arthur C. Clarke. A chunk of the characters there don't have any defined sexuality, so even if it wasn't in the author's mind, you could imagine some of them as queer, be they gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, whatever, but not necessarily shoving the queerness in your face. It may sound a bit odd, but that's something that actually puts me off some stories. Shouting, "Here are the gay characters!" I'm thinking, oh, do you have to be so try hard? I'm bisexual, so I feel like my group is one of the more victimized in terms of bad representation, just because of the stereotypes surrounding bisexuality in fiction. Very wrong stereotypes. So having it's a bit, well, so the counter stereotype thing just makes me grown because it's shoved in your face and it doesn't give the opportunity for it to be normalized because it's still held up as an exceptional thing. So, yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. Antonia, would you like to pick up on your views about how important is queer fiction to you?
Sure. So I'm Antonia Aquilante. I write queer fantasy romance. So yeah, in some ways, well, I come at things from a romance angle in a lot of ways too, because everything I write it's fantasy, but it has that central romance. So I love sci-fi and fantasy. I do want the happy ending for people. Like, so I'm definitely looking for queer spec fic. I'm looking for more of it. I want to read more of it. I'm demisexual, so I absolutely want more ace spec, which is a whole other thing you try to find in which I try to write. But I look for worlds where it's normalized. I look for worlds where, this isn't, you aren't going to find maybe the biases of our world. Like, we're building our own world, so why can't we build them a little bit differently? So, but that's what I love to read. And I love things that, yes, I'm a romance reader, so I don't have to read a romance. I like a romance and I like a happily ever after. So yeah, I look for those things. Plus all the things, you want in a fantasy or a sci-fi story, the great world, everything.
Absolutely. And I feel what you're saying about how as you want to see yourself represented as an LGBTQ plus person. And I think it's very empowering when we see our traits or our personalities reflected in literature. And when you can see yourself and you can see another pansexual, demisexual, or other queer character, and you're like, yes, finally, somebody out there understands me. Even if it's a fantasy, there's still an element of human relation. That's what I just wanted to add to where your train of thought was leading me. Back to EM. EM Anderson, I would like to know, how do other characters respond to your queer character's queerness? Now, are all your characters queer or just some of them? And how do they react to each other?
Sure. And it's just E, like just the letter E is fine.
Oh, sure.
So generally, because I tend to write queer normative worlds, they basically do not react, except to clock each other as queer very quickly. It's actually kind of funny that with my upcoming book, the main character is a queer man, and like this young boy who is kind of questioning, like, asks him, like, how do you know if you like boys? And like all the queer beta readers were like, yes, great. And then one person was like, I don't get it. How did he know he was queer? And I was like, it just, like, I can't explain it, like gaydar. I don't know. I don't know. So it's still that way in the book. Like, there was no, whatever. I'm like, everybody's been watching him make eyes at the love interest. It's fine. They all know by now. It's whatever. So yeah, they tend to really not react. A lot of the other characters tend to be queer themselves. So really, I mean, the main way it comes up in discussion is that kind of situation where like a younger person is questioning their own identity. And so they will ask an older character, or in some cases in my debut, there's a scene where a younger character like explains to an older character because she has some worries about maybe dating this girl and because she thinks she's ace. And she's like, well, what if she doesn't want to date me? Because I don't think I want to have sex, even though I've never had sex, but I'm pretty sure I'm ace. I don't know. And so like it's so it tends to just come up in that sort of situation where the younger character is still figuring it out, so they want to sort of talk it out with someone, and then otherwise everyone just runs around being queer and like nobody reacts to that because it's normalized. because I viscerally hate coming out, and I hate that you have to come out over and over and over to everyone in every situation. I don't do that, by the way. I just put queer in all my social media bios and my book bios, and I'm like, if you don't know, that's your problem. Like, I have broadcasted it to the world, and that's as much as you're getting from me. I'm not gonna just personally tell you, because I hate doing it. So I just love the idea. I love having my characters have this world where, like, really they don't have to come out ever. They can just kind of bring it up if they want to talk it out, but like, otherwise they can just date anyone or be in any sort of queer situation or scene, and it's fine.
I totally get that. And I think the way that you're having that coming out all the time, I understand is very draining and repetitive and look. But I like how you're saying in your storytelling, it's normative, it's okay, it's normal, it's better than okay, it's accepted to be queer. And also that seems to be a closeness between generations where there can be a mentoring situation. And I love that. And I think that's so important in our queer community, that we all have somebody to kind of, lean on, or explain things to us when we're confused, or just a bouncing off point for anybody is a good thing in relationships. So I appreciate that. Now, Antonia, in your world, which is very fantastical and fantasy driven with shape-shifting dragons, I love it. It's such a fascinating, rich world. Do your characters react to each other more because of their queerness, or because of their who they are in their bodies, whether it's dragon or human?
Yeah, I think in the world I've tried to create in these books, yeah, being, queer is absolutely, it's something normal. It's not something that people really remark upon. I mean, I don't think every character in my books is queer, but probably close to it. But yeah, it's not something that really gets remarked upon. I mean, there's romances, obviously. So it's, kind of between love interests, or, you might have like somebody who's, just like reacting to someone they find attractive or interesting or whatever. But yeah, that isn't the thing that's, remarkable. That isn't the thing that's like, there aren't biases against that in these worlds. It's just something that I've tried to create as, normal and accepted. And yeah, nobody is really blinking about it.
I like that, because it's like, in a fantasy world, you can do pretty much whatever you want to do within the rules and boundaries and magic that you've created. But if you can create a fantastical world where it's just as important to have equality as it is to have the magical aspect, to be inclusive of everybody, even if that might not be the point in our society right now that we've reached yet, but in fantasy, you're allowed to do that. And I love that you've done that. Thomas, how about you? Do your characters, are all your characters queer? And how do they react to each other's queerness? Is there bias for or against being queer?
That's interesting, because I didn't approach them being queer. I approached them as being characters, people. So their sexuality came second. But in the sci-fi setting I created, humans are incomers. They're immigrants from their lost ancient Earth. And all the other peoples of the cluster, some level of queerness, whether social or any other kind of thing, is second nature. Humans having strong gender binaries, male-dominated society historically, concepts of solid sexuality is the alien factor. It's not brought up often, but it's brought up enough. So I don't really talk about the characters in terms of queerness. For instance, in the first story, one of the characters' running threads is that he is psychologically having to break away from an abusive relationship. That could equally have been with a woman or with a female or with a male. In the story, it's with a male, but it could equally have been with a female. I didn't approach it like that. I approached it from the character perspective of someone overcoming an abusive relationship and that abuser stalking him into his new life. It's a B plot, so it's not explored as thoroughly as it might be, but yeah, so that's the approach I took. It was a case of they're queer incidentally. So this character, I mean, there's another character in my second book who is gay, but I don't explicitly mention that. It's just always been in my head that Captain Solitaire the Bembo is a gay fellas. And of course, that society is sort of very male oriented and very gay normative. It's just part of their society. It's like, Aikane is the Maori term for that kind of close relationship between men that's basically a same-sex romantic partnership normalized in that culture. I didn't know about it when I was writing the book, but you know.
Well, I really like that, how your characters grew and then their sexuality was attuned to that. So you didn't write them to be gay or queer. They evolved that way naturally.
Yeah.
You didn't assign them like, this one's got to be this one's got to love her, this one's got to love men. No, they came out because of who the characters really spoke to you that they were.
Yeah. The one exception is the final book in the series is a way off being released that is explicitly a romance between a bisexual male and an android in a male body form, male fellas form. So technically a trans man, because their original body was female and human. So but that's an exception rather than anything else, because I wanted that to be a tribute to sort of space romance in a way, alongside a couple of other things.
I can totally see the space romance in there, and it sounds very dark, as well as it could have a twinge of humor in there, I'm suspecting. So I wish you luck on that. That sounds amazing. Back to E. What book in your genre you have read? Is there a book you have read that has queer normative world building besides your own, or have you only found that in your own stories?
Yeah, I have actually two recommendations that are actually just my go-to book recommendations when people ask for fantasy, just in general. So the first one is actually a novella, Emily Tesch's Silver in the Wood. So it's like kind of a folkloric fantasy. I read it twice in 1 month the first time that I read it because it was just so good. I really loved it. So that one is queer normative. And then also Sungu Mandana's The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. So in that one, the main character is not queer, but there is an older gay couple who are fairly major characters, and so it's totally normalized there. And then I just have to mention her upcoming book that currently is slated to come out in April, A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping. That one sounds like it will have more major queer characters. The main character is like great aunt who has been like raised from the dead, and this like little old lady who lives at their inn who is madly in love with her. And there's also going to be an undead rooster. I'm deeply excited for this book. I cannot overstate how excited I am for this book, actually. But in the meantime, you can read The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches, which again is one that is just like a go-to, like it's like a warm hug. I love it so much. It's a very good book just in general, also queer normative, and then Silver in the Wood as well.
Oh my goodness, those sound so good and interesting. Thank you. And yeah, this ghost and the woman in love with the ghost, that's just awesome. I love it. Thank you, E. How about Antonia? I mean, how about Thomas? What book do you have, any books that you would recommend that have queer normative fictional world building in them, or have you only noticed that in your own world building?
I think I can give a huge recommendation to the work of Ursula K. Le Guin. Especially her, oh, I forget the name of the sci-fi series she did, but there are two. One I have read, one I haven't. One is The Left Hand of Darkness, I think it's called, and that has one of the earliest examples of a gender neutral species as a key player. There's another one that I vaguely remember. The word for world is forest. Just that whole section is, she is very progressive, or was very progressive in her day when it came to queer inclusion, queer normative creations. Also, I haven't got on with his work, but Samuel R. Delany is also one of the writers who sort of pushed forward a bit queer representation, not just in sci-fi, but in fiction in general. It helped that he was gay, I think. He is, rather, he's still alive and happily partnered. But yeah, it's the weird thing is I don't specifically look for queer fiction. I look for good fiction. So yeah.
Well, I think that's great, and I agree with your analysis. And I love that. I think it's interesting when you're looking, because I read a little bit of everything too. I don't necessarily read just queer fiction, but I do make a point to find it.
Oh.
Because I think I want to see myself, and I want to see characters that I can relate to. And also, I feel like queer people
called?
in general need
What
more
is it called?
representation.
Yeah, there's another one I remember. I need to grab it quickly. I've got it in my bookshelf. Sorry, hold on
Oh,
a second. I won't be a
sure.
second.
Oh, fine. I love when we can share books with each other. It's one of the best parts about being not just an author or a writer, but a reader. And I think reading is the best way to learn how to become a better writer too. All right, let's see.
Sorry, a definite recommendation if you can find it. It has queer character representation. It's of its time, so not necessarily happy, but In the Country of the Blind by Michael Flynn, it is the GOAT. It's one of the best hard science fiction stories I've read in a long time. So yeah,
Wow. And what was that called again?
In the Country of the Blind. Actually,
In the
I'll
Country
I'll
of
put
the
it in the
Blind.
chat, then you can carry on with, sorry I interrupted things.
No, that was really interesting. Thank you, Thomas. That was great. Yeah, please put it in the chat. Antonia, I was wondering, we've all been talking about building queer normative word building in science fiction and fantasy and alternative worlds. How can we advance queer normative world building? How can we make sure, what can we do as authors to embrace this as normalcy? Is it just with the characters being queer? Does there have to be a queer culture in your book? Does there have to be a queer club or a place? Does it have to be, do you have to be queer specific in your writing, or can it be, or what can we do to further representation in literature? I'll give that one to Antonia first.
Oh, give me the hard ones.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I think there are different, I mean, I don't know. I guess in my opinion, there are maybe different ways to go about it depending on your own story, right? Because everything has to fit the story and the world you're building. It can't just be, let me throw this in there, for the hell of it, right? So I think in some ways we advance this by doing it, and maybe there are different ways of doing it. Not every world is going to look the same. I think obviously, for queer normative world building, we need a world where there isn't a bias against people being LGBTQ+, right? There isn't, we don't have homophobia, we don't have transphobia in our world. Like we don't have those, that bigotry in our world. I think it can look different I write in each book, whether it's, you know, depending on the characters, depending on the type of world, like maybe how we show that or how the characters interact can be a little bit different, whether it's, you know, in a fantasy world, an alternate world, you know, fantasy, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's, you know, historical, paranormal or something. Like it's going to kind of depend on, I think that to kind of maybe make the details a little bit different. But I think, yeah, I think at the core of it, it's making sure that we have worlds, whether, you know, whether everyone in the book is queer or some people are, some people aren't, it's showing that in this world, whatever it is, this is normal, this is accepted, this is not a remarkable thing. This is, and frankly, I don't know, to me, it's just like, well, yeah, okay, this is how it should be, right? This is how everything should be. This is how our world should be, where it's just not,
Yes.
you know. So for me, it's, yeah, writing that into existence, and the details of how it's expressed might be a little different depending on the world you're writing in. But yeah,
I
I
totally
think
get
they're-
that. Yeah, because if you can erase the bias in a society, then you open up equality for people in a way that we haven't seen yet in our world. And I think that's why it's so important that authors like you write fantasy, to show us that it can exist. And I think that's so important that your world building that you do in your fantasy books, you make it so there's obviously clashes between different groups, but it's not because of their queerness. And I think that's powerful. What do you think we can do to advance queer normative world building in our science fiction and fantasy? I know you write more space age stuff. So in futurism and futuristic sci-fi and fantasy, do you think where it's a new thing to be queer normative, or in your world building, has it always been that way? Has it always been that way, or is that something society had to work forward to get to?
That is an interesting question. So, okay, so in my debut, which is like, so people describe it as alternative history, which I guess technically it is. I don't consider it alternative history because I'm like, we're in the real world today and magic exists openly, but also nothing has changed. Everything in history has turned out the way it turned out, whatever. Because that just was not, which I know some people are totally going to hate. They're like, they did not explore this at all. And it's because I was not interested in exploring it. I was interested in writing a story about a little old lady on a fantasy adventure. And that was what I was doing. But so that world is queer normative, and honestly, like, is the world queer normative, or are you just seeing characters who like don't care and it's fine and they're accepting? And so like what you like the world of the story that you see is queer normative, but maybe there's like homophobia happening somewhere else, but like the characters aren't partaking in it, so it's like not a thing. So, and then in my upcoming book, which is still set in the present day, but the main character is cursed with immortality, and he was born in the early 19th century. And so there is, so the town he's in is queer normative because like everybody is just queer there. So like, it's very queer normative in this town. But there is reference to like him, like having a relationship with another young man when he was young back home. And them being, him especially being like scared to being found out about that because it was not normalized because it's like real world early 19th century, and also reference to like later in their relationship where they lived somewhere else and like technically everyone kind of knew, but you just called them bachelors, and if you invited one of them to your party you knew the other one was going to show up like that. So yeah. Like yeah, so it's very much more like it's, and there's also his love interest, who is another older man, mentions being from a small town elsewhere, and he mentions that it's not as accepting. So it's really like this particular spot in the story, this small town, is very queer normative, but but just the sense that like the broader world isn't necessarily and hasn't been, but for the duration of the story while we're in this small town, it's going to be this nice place that's queer normative and where you don't have to worry about those things. So I think that's I almost think that's more how I approach it, is I'm like, I'm just going to show this place or these people being accepting of queerness and queerness being allowed to exist openly without worrying about those things. But it doesn't necessarily mean the broader world is queer normative, because I am working in the real world. But I also have no interest in showing those things, because I'm like, we deal enough with the hatred and laws against queerness in real life. And it's important to have those stories. Absolutely. I'm like, I would never suggest that like no one should write those stories. It's just not a story that I want to write, because I would rather write of a world that's like a little bit better, or at least the part of the world we're seeing is a little bit better, and we can hope that eventually it'll all get there. More broadly,
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
More broadly, I think just the more people who are writing queer normative stories, which again, not everyone has to. I mean, it's important to have coming out stories. It's important to have stories about the struggles that queer people face. But in terms of advancing queer normative world building in sci-fi and fantasy, I do think just the more people who do it and the more books that are like that get published, I think that just just having more of it. Like, I don't know if anybody saw that post on Threads within the last couple days that was like, I'm so glad to have like a greater variety of queer books now, because now if a queer book is bad and I don't like it, I don't feel like I'm like betraying Stonewall. And so I feel like that is a good, like, the more of them we have, just the better it is, just in general.
I agree with you. And I think because you're writing more about the future, I mean, about the present and society as it is now, but you can make your own little towns that come from different places. For me, I'm in Massachusetts, USA, and there's a city here called Provincetown or P-Town, where it's very well known that you're accepted no matter what no matter where you fall on the rainbow flag. This is your place to thrive and be yourself.
I just saw actually a video on Facebook about Provincetown, and I was like,
oh,
well,
really?
I have to go there. Yeah, there was like I was like, that looks very queer, and I would like to go there eventually.
I recommend it for anybody, especially if you are queer, because it's just like, oh, everybody can be themselves and it's nice. It's really, and also it correlates to your stories where some small towns can be very welcoming. And then there's others where you're afraid to come out. And even if you already are out, you're afraid to talk about it. So I appreciate that in your world building, that you take the time to show places where it could be done, but then you talk more about the story rather than the misery of our society. And Thomas, I'm going to ask you what you think. How can we advance queer normative world building in science fiction and fantasy as far as your books go? I know you've mentioned there's relationships in your books. How do these people find each other? Are there some sort of dating sites they have to go on to? How do they know that how do they know, how do they know that it's okay to be queer? Is it already built in to the world building where, oh, this is these two are a couple and this person is dating all these people? Or is it part of your character? I know you said your characters don't come out to you as queer until they've already formatted who they are. So how important is it to you that you have that queer representation in these books for your world building?
I think it's very important because regardless of how much it's suppressed in a lot of history books historically, queerness has been there since Babylonian Sumerian times. The myth of Ashurnamir, a non-gender binary being created to save the goddess Ishtar from Ereshkigal, goddess of the underworld. That is an inspiring piece of mythology. So as to how I incorporated it, straight people don't necessarily need dating sites to find each other. So I didn't really think about it like that. That's part of what it's about for me. I don't exceptionalize it any more than I exceptionalize a straight relationship. And I think that's important because that's a way, in this essence, of, for any readers I do get, touch wood, of normalizing it so that they feel it's more normal in real life. Because there's an excellent example in history of a piece of fiction influencing real life. The 1961 film Victim was a very sympathetic portrayal of gay men and the anti-homosexuality laws that existed in Britain at the time being basically a free pass to blackmail. That film came out a number of years before the law was repealed, but it helped galvanize sentiment in the UK against it by portraying gay men not as perverts or weirdos or needing to be suppressed, but as people who were being victimized by people many times worse, but the law was disinclined to intervene because in this situation being gay was the greater crime than a blackmail syndicate driving people to criminality and suicide. I mean, actors risked their careers to be in that movie and it paid off. And so, yeah, I think it's very important, whether it's speculative fiction, historical fiction, normalize it without dramatizing it and have all kinds of endings and all kinds of story arcs. And you make people realize, actually, in real life, you can be like that and is not seen as weird.
I love that because, like you said, how do we find each other as friends or dates or romantic partners or comrades? We don't need, we find each other. We don't need, I think it's something that doesn't translate all the time to straight readers, that gay people, queer people are the same as straight people. We're all have the same wants and needs and desires. But like you're saying in this movie, what was the name of it again?
Just Victim. I mean, that's what it was. That's what it was about. Victim.
What a great way to showcase how people in society, how queer people are just people. And I think in your work, the way that you've built up your characters to be strong characters and just like strong people, sexuality is part of who they are, but that doesn't mean it's all of them. Like they still have wishes and hopes and dreams and anger and frustration that doesn't relate to their sexuality. I think that's important that you made three-dimensional queer characters because they have these strengths to begin with. Now I would like to kind of turn it back to the authors, give you a chance to brag a little bit. I would like to know what your favorite story is that you've written that features queer characters and queer world building. Antonia, let's hear about the favorite thing that you've written.
Okay, I feel like asking for a favorite. Is that asking like your favorite child or something?
I know, it's awful. Tell me other books not to listen.
Oh, that's like, oh no, oh my gosh. Okay. All right. I don't know if it's my favorite. I love it though. It's my latest published book. It's called To Love the Dragon King. It's the first book in my Dragons of Ivrea. Sorry, Zoom is popping up windows in front of me, and that was distracting. Sorry. It's the first book in my Dragons of Ivrea fantasy romance series. So yeah, I mean it is basically it's a society of so all right. There's a larger world outside of this kingdom of Ivrea, but basically what happened is in the past in this world, people who had this magical ability to be able to turn into dragons were hunted in the wider world. So at some point, they found their way together from all points in the world and founded their own kingdom hidden away in the mountains, both because they are impassable if you cannot fly and also magical issues and stuff. But in any case, so they founded their own society. And yeah, being queer is not special. It's not something that's, weird or it's just normal there. The same as being straight, it doesn't, sexuality or gender isn't something there's no biases or bigotries associated with those things. There's part of the plot and part of this, there's a conspiracy plot that has some people who are very, we'll call bigoted against people who do not have the ability to change into dragons, but that's obviously separate. And yeah, there's a romance between a bisexual man and a gray ace man, both cisgender in that book. The second book in the series that hopefully I will finish and get out soon has the main characters both bisexual. One is cisgender, the other's trans. But yeah, it's not anything that's really, it's just part of their character. It's part of who they are, but it's not what the story is revolving around. It's, magic and conspiracies and romance. So
that is wonderful because it shows you can immerse yourself into this romantic fantasy story where there's inclusive and varied romantic relationships, and without the same old, okay, the prince has to save the princess from the dragon. Like, your story is completely different, and I love that.
Yeah, in the third book, the princess is a dragon shifter, so that one should be interesting. But I can't wait to get there sooner or later.
Well, I can't wait to add it to my to be read list. So E, what is your favorite piece of work that you've written, and how do you feel that it contributed to normalcy of world building and characters within the LGBTQ plus community?
Okay, well, the first part of that I can at least pretend to answer, and the second part I'm like, I don't know, let someone else decide how it's contributed, if at all. I will say a lot of readers I will preface this by saying I only read good reviews that a friend has gone and found and sent to me. I do not hang out in readers' faces to look at reviews because I feel like that would just be a very terrible idea. So I only read reviews.
I agree. And it's you didn't write it for reviews.
They're not for me, but sometimes if I've had a bad day or something, I'm like, hey, can you go find 5-star reviews for me to read and feel better? And so I end up reading good reviews. So a lot of the good reviews of my debut particularly liked, there are multiple asexual characters who just identify with different parts of the spectrum. Most of them actually don't have language for that, so they're not identified by a term, but the way their experience is described is hopefully relatable to anyone who's had similar experiences. And then one person actually does use the word ace and then has to explain it to the main character, who is then like, huh, this feels familiar, sort of. Well, I have dragons to worry about, so we'll worry about that later. So I think just having multiple asexual characters in a fantasy adventure story, it seemed like readers really liked that and were like, this is cool, we want more of this. My favorite, it's so hard to pick, it's what Antonia said at the start of her answer, you can't, it's a favorite child, how are you supposed to choose? I am incredibly proud of my upcoming book. I love my debut, but The Keeper of Lonely Spirits, which is the upcoming cozy fantasy, is next level for me in terms of craft. To the point that when I started writing it, I was like, I don't know that I am a good enough writer to write this book yet, but there's only one way to find out. So I just kind of did it anyway. And here we are.
You got to do.
March. yeah, and it turned out, I mean, it's what I want it to be. It turned out what I wanted it to be, which is, I think, the best any writer can hope for, really. So I really love that one. Again, it's like a small town, in a fictional small town, I should say, in Northwest Ohio. And like everyone's queer, and it's fine. And it's got ghosts, and the old man whose main character is cursed with immortality. Because I love a sad immortal who does not want to be alive anymore.
Yes.
And yeah, like, oh, I love that. I love that trope. And yeah, so I think I really love it from just like a craft perspective. I'm very deeply proud of it. I'm really happy that my editor like just really got what I was doing, and all of her suggestions were like so on point with just everything. And even if she had a suggestion that I didn't like the specific suggestion, it like I could see where she was coming from, and I usually could like suggest an alternative that was like accomplished the same thing but in a way I liked better, or that was easier for me in some cases. So I really liked that. And then I also the current thing I'm working on, I can't talk too much about, I don't think, but this one is really fun because it's different for me. So it's actually not, so okay, it's not queer normative, except it is, but like in the way that my other stories are, where like the greater world is maybe not queer normative, and the small town that this character is from is not queer normative, to the point that he is in his 40s and he does not realize he's queer. He's like, oh, alas, I have never found the right girl. How tragic. And like at some point his love interest makes a face like, the right girl, the right girl, the right does not, like he doesn't say anything, but he just kind of makes a face, and you're just supposed to understand that he's going, the right girl. So that's kind of fun because I do not often write characters who don't know that about themselves. And so like, it's just kind of, it's not fun for the love interest. He's having an aneurysm, but it's really fun for me that this main character has, like, he loves romance novels, but they're all kind of like 1980s bodice ripper type romance novels. So he sort of in the first draft just wandered into a bunch of very 1980s bodice ripper scenarios. Like there's an intimate like shaving scene, and then they bathe in a waterfall and stuff. And he's like, huh, this is weird how this is making me feel, strange, whatever. And he just kind of like goes on. And meanwhile, the love interest is like super aware of like how intimate this is. And it's just like,
Wow.
5 seconds
Love
from
it.
dying at any moment. So like that's been really fun for me. I think I'll have to probably reel it in a little bit in the second draft for the sake of like coherence and getting on with the story. But it's been like, in terms of just being fun to write, it's been so fun to write. It's ridiculous. And so I've really enjoyed drafting that.
I think as a writer, when you're really having fun is when the best parts of your story come out, because you're enjoying it. Now, there's times where you're crying, there's times when you're upset, or you're just writing because it's your job to write. But when you can get to where you're making yourself feel emotions from your own words, when you're laughing to yourself, when you're smiling, when you're like, this person, I can hear their voice in my head, that's when you know you've got it. You've achieved. Thomas, I would like to ask you what your favorite work is that you've written, and how you believe it has affected or been affected by queer normative world building.
Well, once again, as with E and Antonia, that's like trying to pick a favorite child. I'll answer the second part first. In terms of influence, I only recently debuted. I have no idea. In terms of how queer normativeness has affected it, well, I never really thought of it in those terms, so that's a very short part of the answer. But in terms of, favorite queer characters, well, I could pick a half dozen maybe. The one I had the most emotional catharsis writing was the character I mentioned earlier who was escaping an abusive relationship, Gaspard Atarex. And his arc was very emotional to write because he does not bottle it up, or rather he does, and it makes him worse. And when he doesn't bottle it up, and a fun fact, my editor actually, good 10 minutes. Fun fact, my editor actually wanted me to tone up the amount, because I hadn't made it very clear that he still hated his abuser by the end of the story. I'd sort of forgotten that bit, so I bumped it up. So he does not forgive his abuser of any of that. It's not that kind of story. There's another one where there's basically a character who I based on Oscar Wilde, a lesbian with a
Ooh.
partner, and I gave an Oscar Wilde like the happy ending that the real Oscar Wilde never got. There's another one, it's the third one, it's upcoming, it's a detective story, and the main characters are a lesbian assassin, for formalized murderer assassin type, and an asexual policeman investigating a murder, sort of, but from two different sides. Then, of course, there's a queer romance in the final book. The fourth book has an asexual lead, which was amazing to write because I didn't have to bother with anything other than her intellectual and emotional connection to something, not because of stuff that you might consider sexual, but because of connecting with them deeply as a person. And of course, in the second one that I did a reading of earlier, Lost Station Circe, I didn't really focus on sexuality much in that one, but the main character, the boy Farah, is in a relationship with someone who is female presenting but uses they them pronouns, which is the first time I'd ever done that in my writing, which was fun. So that's about a half dozen, sort of take your pick, but the first two you can find plenty. And ugh.
Well, I know it's so hard to choose your favorite, but I think you've shown us a few really interesting bits of different characters that you've written, and how their relationships with each other create world building. And I appreciate that. Are there any other questions or comments anybody would like to throw in about queer normative world building, or about other books that have helped them write this sort of world, or another book that's one of their favorites to read or write? Anything, or any shows that you have upcoming, any author readers, author events? Antonia E. or Thomas, feel free to hop in.
Well, I don't have anything coming up outside of BristolCon where I'm attending. I don't know whether I'm doing anything, but it's not a book, but in terms of queer normative world building and actually pretty well written queer characters, Dragon Age. It's extremely well written, especially Dragon Age Inquisition has some great characters, and Cassandra is best girl, Iron Bull is best boy, and Iron Bull gay romance route is just beautiful. It's wonderful, and it's the best fictional representation of a BDSM relationship I have seen anywhere.
Wow.
Period.
Wow.
So that's my recommendation. Oh, maybe not Mass Effect most of the time, because that can delve into some unpleasant stereotypes at times, but Dragon Age.
All right, cool. Thank you. How about you, Antonia or E? Anything you want to add about what you really enjoy, or an event you have coming up as an author, if you have an author signing or anything like that?
Okay, well, so I think I'm done with like events for the year. I do have one left, but it's for booksellers. I'm glad I'm done for the year, because last year I did one event a month and I was like, that's too much. And then in August and September this year, I had like 2 events a month and I was like, okay, why did I do this to myself? But anyway, I do have, as I mentioned, a book coming out in March. It is a cozy fantasy set in a fictional town in Northwest Ohio about an old man cursed with immortality who hunts ghosts rather than making mortal friends who are just going to die on him one day. And then the Ohio townspeople just like aggressively adopt him, and then he has to kind of decide whether to stay and see out this ghost hunt, despite the fact that he feels like this is a danger to him at this point, or if he's just going to leave and like leave them at the mercy of this vengeful spirit. So that is called The Keeper of Lonely Spirits, and I will drop a Goodreads link in the chat. And I don't
Please do.
I don't have a date yet, but I should be doing a cover reveal sometime soon. So I'm just waiting on approval from my editor. So just watch my social media, which I will also throw in the chat. And then if you subscribe to my newsletter, whenever I get to do the cover reveal, you will get the cover first. So
Exciting.
That's my plug.
Nice, thank you. And how about you, Antonia? Do you have anything else you would like to talk about your favorite book that you've written or read, or about what author events you have coming up?
Let's see, I don't have any author events scheduled like right now for the rest of the year. That might change, something local might pop up. I like to do you know, if there are opportunities to do library events and things, I will jump on them because I do enjoy them. But I always, you know, post that on my website and certainly my newsletter. So yeah, if you follow me there, you will, and social media, you'll get all of that stuff. Let's see.
Wonderful. Why don't you post that in the links in the chat so everybody can see them and follow you?
I will post those. And yeah, other than that, yeah, not too much. Second book in the Dragons of Ivrea series should hopefully be coming out soon. I'm self-publishing it. I'm self-publishing this series. Honestly, I had planned for this book to be out months ago, but long COVID has messed up my entire schedule for this entire past year.
Oh no.
So that's been fun. But yeah, we're getting closer. I also I have a gorgeous cover. I've been sitting on it for so long. I'm tired of sitting on it. I'm going to share it in my newsletter probably next month anyway. So if you would like to
Ooh.
see the beautiful cover, even though I don't have buy links yet, join my newsletter. I'm gonna pop
Exciting.
links in the chat now.
Awesome. Please do. And so if you have any links, Thomas, you'd like to put in for your work, please add that to the chat. And again, my name is Jessica Lucci. You can find me pretty much on every social media, but if anybody wants to connect with me, the best way is to do it through my website, which is www.jessicalucci, that's LUCCI.org. I want to thank everybody for coming to this panel. Thank you to all our attendees. Thank you to our audience. Thank you to my wonderful guests. And I think this has been a really interesting time of talking about character building and world building to make things equal and normal, to make our society equal and normal someday. And I just want to thank Rainbow Space Magic for this amazing event you've created. Once again, awesome. Thank you. And everybody, I'll sign off now. Happy reading.
I'll end it in 1 sec. Someone asked if I could grab all the recommendations out of the chat.
Sure.
I will do.
Sure, we want to share these books. We want to share ourselves and get our words out into the world. Because even as E said about book reviews and how they can be really, you can internalize what people say for the good or for the negative. And so I like your idea of having people send you a copy of a good book review when it comes in. And I think book reviews are a great way for readers to communicate with other readers. But when you hear something nice, something a reader appreciated, then it reminds you that you have reached somebody in a positive way. And I think that's part of our art as writers. So thank you everybody for your recommendations.
Okay, I think I've got everything. So I will go ahead and end this one here so that the recording will end too. And then we have our last panel in half an hour. So we'll see everybody in there. And thanks.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to seeing it. Thank you, everybody. You rock.